Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most fascinating and heartbreaking love stories that wasn't really about love at all. Picture this. November 6th, 1895, New York City. A young woman stands in her bedroom, 18 years old, wearing the most exquisite wedding gown money could buy, diamond-encrusted garters, real lace lingerie, silk stockings that gleam like moonlight. But here's what makes this moment unforgettable. She's weeping uncontrollably, alone. A footman guards her door, letting no one comfort her. In just hours, she'll marry one of England's most powerful men. She'll become a duchess. But as she writes that morning, she feels cold and numb, like an automaton. Outside, thousands gather for a glimpse of this wedding that will shake 2 continents. Inside, a girl is being sold, her name Consuelo Vanderbilt, and her story changes everything. Before we dive deeper, I'd love you to join our community here. If this story has captured you already, if you're curious what happens next, hit that subscribe button. And if you're genuinely enjoying this, like means the world, I'm always curious, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, I read everyone. Alright, get comfortable, dim those lights, let the world slow down, and let's step back together to an era of unimaginable wealth and unexpected desperation. The year is 1870 and America is about to explode with money. I mean truly explode. Historians call this the Gilded Age, gilded not golden, because as Mark Twain cleverly noted, everything was covered in thin gold paint hiding problems underneath. But oh, what a layer of gold it was. Think about names you know: Vanderbilt, Astor, Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie. These weren't just rich men, they were titans who'd literally reshaped America. Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled railroads. John D. Rockefeller monopolized oil. J.P. Morgan commanded banking like a general commands armies. These robber barons, though they preferred captains of industry, had accumulated wealth that would make today's billionaires blush. Fortunes worth hundreds of billions in today's money. And here's where it gets interesting. These men had something else in common: daughters. Beautiful, educated, accomplished daughters. Young women raised in marble mansions who spoke perfect French, played Chopin flawlessly, wore gowns costing more than most earned yearly. By every measure, these girls had everything, except one thing, one crucial, painful thing. They weren't accepted. How could the richest girls in America not be accepted? Here's the twist. Old money, New York society was ruled by Caroline Astor. Mrs. Astor had a ballroom holding exactly 400 people. She kept a list literally called the 400 of who was acceptable in high society. And here's the brutal part: if your father had actually worked for his money, if he dirtied his hands in business, if he was new money, you didn't make the list. It didn't matter how many millions your father had. It didn't matter how beautiful, talented, or educated you were. If your grandfather wasn't on the list, neither were you. The daughters of these industrial giants, girls who could buy anything, couldn't buy their way into Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Can you imagine that, having everything yet feeling like you have nothing? Is almost tragically funny. Here you are in a mansion with your own ballroom, wearing jewels that belong to European queens, yet you're sitting home while girls from proper families who might have less money attend the season's most important balls. The mothers felt this rejection even more acutely. Women like Alva Vanderbilt, Mrs. Jerome, Mrs. Lita, they were ambitious, fierce, determined. They hadn't clawed up the social ladder to have their daughters dismissed, and these women were not the type to accept defeat. So they looked across the Atlantic Ocean and saw something fascinating. In England, there was an aristocracy drowning in titles but gasping for cash. Dukes in literally crumbling castles, earls who couldn't heat ancestral homes, viscounts watching farmlands fail, rental income evaporating, their way of life slipping away. These men had everything American girls wanted: ancient names, noble titles, acceptance at society's highest levels, presentation at court, proximity to royalty. And these American mothers had exactly what English aristocrats needed: mountains of money. Somewhere between New York and London, someone had a brilliant, calculated, somewhat cold-blooded idea. What if we made a deal? Your title for our cash, your prestige for our millions, your duke for our daughter. And thus the dollar princesses were born. Between 1870 and 1914, over 40 years, something extraordinary happened. According to a book published in 1915 called Titled Americans, at least 450 wealthy American women married into European aristocracy. 454. That's not isolated incidents. That's a phenomenon, a movement, a mass migration of money and ambition across an ocean. 102 marriages were to British aristocrats specifically. And here's a staggering number: these women brought dowries estimated at over $4 billion in today's money. $4 billion. Transferred from American accounts to English estates. One of history's largest wealth transfers, all wrapped in white wedding gowns and veils. The British had a phrase for it. They said American heiresses had married more than a third of the House of Lords. Picture that. Walking into British Parliament realizing over 30% of lords sitting there had American wives and American money keeping their estates afloat. But here's what makes this story truly compelling. These weren't just financial transactions. These were real young women. Teenagers mostly. Girls with dreams, girls who fell in love with wrong men, girls who wanted to choose their own paths. And they were being packaged, presented, essentially sold to strangers in foreign countries. Some went willingly dazzled by becoming a duchess or countess. Some went reluctantly pressured by ambitious mothers. And some, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, crying in her bedroom that November morning, were literally forced, locked in rooms, threatened, coerced until they broke. This worked for everyone involved, at least on paper. British aristocrats got cash saving their estates. American families got titles opening previously slammed doors. And the girls, they got tiaras, presentation to the Queen, Duchess, or Lady before their names. Whether they got happiness is another story entirely. But understand something crucial. This wasn't romantic fairy tale no matter how it looks in photographs. This was business. Pure, calculated business dressed in orange blossoms and lace. Families literally published guides like classified ads, listing available aristocrats, their titles, estates, debts, even scandals. Lord So-and-so, age 48, heavily mortgaged estate, sown wild oats extensively. That's an actual listing. They were shopping for sons-in-law like shopping for real estate. And yet, something unexpected happened. Some women became remarkable forces for change. They brought American confidence to stuffy English drawing rooms. They championed women's suffrage, became political powers. They saved estates, yes, but transformed them too. They weren't just bought brides, many refused to be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still in 1870 at this phenomenon's very beginning, watching pieces move into place, like chess pieces on a transatlantic board. The stage is set. America has money but no prestige. Britain has prestige but no money. And caught in the middle are hundreds of young women about to discover that being a dollar princess comes with a price no currency can calculate. So in our next part, we're crossing that ocean. We need to understand exactly what was happening in Britain that made these marriages not just attractive, but absolutely necessary for survival. Because until you grasp how desperate the British aristocracy had become, you can't fully understand why they opened their most exclusive club to American outsiders, something unthinkable just a generation earlier. What was happening to Britain's great estates, to ancient families, to the entire foundation of aristocratic life? It's a story of decline, both fascinating and heartbreaking. And it explains everything about why our crying bride in New York was about to become the Duchess of Marlborough, whether she wanted to or not. Stay with me. Let me cross the Atlantic with you now. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine England in 1875. Not the England you see in movies all pristine and perfect. I want you to see the real England, the one falling apart at the seams while trying desperately to maintain appearances. Blenheim Palace. You've probably seen pictures. It's one of the most magnificent estates in all of Britain, home to the Dukes of Marlborough for generations. Over 200 rooms, thousands of acres. A building so grand that it was given to the Churchill family by a grateful nation after the first Duke won a major military victory in 1704. But here's what the photographs don't show. By the 1890s, it was slowly crumbling. The roof leaked in 47 places. Yes, someone actually counted. 47 places where rain dripped into one of England's most prestigious homes. The heating system was medieval, literally. There was no hot running water. Can you imagine a palace, a genuine palace, and you needed servants to carry hot water up multiple flights of stairs just to take a bath? And Blenheim wasn't unique. This was happening everywhere. See, here's what we don't talk about enough when we romanticize British aristocracy by the late 19th century. They were broke. And I don't mean, oh dear, we might have to cut back on champagne, broke. I mean genuinely terrifyingly watching their entire world collapse broke. Let me paint you a picture of how money worked for these families, because it's crucial to understanding everything that follows. British aristocrats didn't work. Let me say that again, for emphasis: they did not work. It wasn't that they were lazy, it was that working was beneath them. Their entire identity, their entire social standing rested on the fact that they were above such things. A gentleman could be a member of parliament, an army officer, maybe a very lightly employed clergyman, but running a business, taking a job and managing actual work that would be social suicide. So how did they live land? Agricultural land. For centuries, the aristocracy's wealth came from massive estates, where tenant farmers grew crops and paid rent. It was a system that had worked beautifully for generations. The aristocrats owned the land, farmers worked it. Rent money flowed steadily upward and everyone knew their place. Until suddenly, catastrophically, it didn't work anymore. Starting in the mid-1870s, something happened that the British aristocracy never saw coming. American farmers started cultivating the Great Plains. Those vast prairies we learned about in school, they became the most productive wheat-growing region the world had ever seen. And here's the kicker: new technology made it cheap to ship all that wheat across the Atlantic. Steamships, refrigerated cargo holds. By 1880, American prairie wheat was flooding British markets at prices British farmers simply couldn't compete with. The numbers tell a devastating story. In 1867, wheat in Britain sold for 56 shillings per quarter. By 1894, just 27 years later, it had crashed to 22 shillings and 10 pence. That's not a dip, that's a collapse. The lowest wheat prices Britain had seen in 150 years. Think about what that meant. If you're a duke, whose income comes entirely from farmers renting your land to grow wheat, and wheat prices drop by more than half, what happens? Your tenant farmers can't pay their rent. They go bankrupt. They abandon the land, and suddenly you're a duke with a title, a castle, thousands of acres, and no money coming in. Between 1871 and 1900, the amount of land in Britain growing cereals dropped by 22%. 22%. Meanwhile, over 90,000 agricultural labourers left farming for the cities, looking for work in the new factories. The entire economic foundation of aristocratic life was disintegrating. And these families had enormous expenses. I'm talking staggering costs that never stopped. Let me give you some examples that might make your jaw drop. The typical aristocratic estate employed dozens, sometimes hundreds of servants: butlers, housekeepers, ladies' maids, footmen, coachmen, gardeners, gamekeepers. Each one needed wages, housing, food. The Duke of Westminster's estate in the 1890s employed over 300 people, 300 salaries every month, no matter what wheat prices did. Then there's the maintenance. These weren't modern homes, they were medieval castles and Tudor manors that required constant expensive upkeep. Roofs needed replacing, stone walls needed repairing. The heating systems that did exist were inefficient and cost fortunes to run. Many aristocrats simply closed off entire wings of their homes because they couldn't afford to maintain them. And here's something that might surprise you: taxes were going up. The British government, now increasingly controlled by middle-class politicians rather than aristocrats, started imposing what they called death duties, essentially inheritance taxes. In 1894, they introduced the estate duty. Every time an aristocrat died, his heir had to pay a significant percentage of the estate's value to the government. For families whose wealth was entirely in land and buildings rather than cash, this was devastating. So picture this scenario, and this actually happened to multiple families. The old duke dies. His son inherits a title, a massive estate, a castle, priceless art furniture, heirlooms going back centuries. On paper, he's incredibly wealthy, but he has to pay death duties in cash immediately, and there's no cash. The wheat isn't selling. The tenant farmers aren't paying rent. To raise the money for taxes, he has to start selling things: the paintings, the land. Piece by piece, the family's actual wealth shrinks while they desperately try to maintain appearances. Do you know what's almost darkly funny about this? The British aristocracy had spent centuries building this elaborate culture around not working around leisure, being the mark of true nobility. An 1880s aristocrat literally could not take a job without losing his entire social standing. It would be shameful, humiliating. You'd be mocked, excluded, treated like you'd betrayed your class. So you have these men, educated, intelligent, capable men, sitting in cold, leaking castles, watching their fortunes evaporate, and they can't do the one thing that might save them work for money. Their pride won't let them. Their culture won't let them. Their entire identity is built around being above such things. And the irony gets even richer. While British aristocrats are desperately trying to maintain their lifestyle on shrinking incomes across the Atlantic, American industrialists are making money faster than they can count it. By the late 19th century, British manufacturers had actually eclipsed the aristocracy as the richest class in the nation. As Prime Minister Arthur Balfour noted in 1909, the bulk of the great fortunes are now in a highly liquid state. They do not consist of huge landed estates, vast parks and castles, and all the rest of it. The world had changed, money had changed, power had changed. But the British aristocracy was still trying to live like it was 1750. Enter the American heiresses. Suddenly, these desperate families saw a solution. These American girls didn't have titles, didn't have pedigree, didn't have the centuries of bloodline the British valued so highly. But they had something infinitely more useful: enormous liquid wealth, cash, stocks, bonds, the kind of money that could patch 47 leaks in a palace roof, the kind of money that could pay hundreds of servants, the kind of money that could settle death duties and save an estate from being broken up and sold. And what did these American families want in return? Something the British had in abundance and cost them nothing: titles, a signature on a marriage certificate, the right to be called Lady or Duchess or Countess. It must have seemed almost too good to be true, don't you think? Like a perfect economic exchange. The British had prestige without cash. The Americans had cash without prestige. Simple trade. Except nothing involving human hearts is ever simple. Because here's what we're about to discover when you start treating marriages like business transactions, when you turn young women into commodities and young men into titles for sale, when you mix desperation with ambition and add a dash of cold calculation. Well, you create situations that are complicated, messy, sometimes triumphant, often tragic, and always deeply human. The stage was set. The aristocrats needed money desperately. The American families wanted acceptance desperately. And caught between these desperate needs were real people who were about to have their lives negotiated like contracts. But before we meet more of these remarkable women, before we dive into the specific stories of heartbreak and triumph, I want to introduce you to the woman who started it all, the pioneer, the first American girl to make this transatlantic leap, because her story explains everything about how this phenomenon began, and her son would become one of the most famous men in history. Her name was Jenny Jerome, and when she met a young British lord at a sailing party in 1873, neither of them could have imagined that their whirlwind romance would set a pattern that hundreds would follow. Jenny Jerome wasn't supposed to change history. She was just supposed to have a nice time at a sailing party. It's August 1873, and the scene is Cowes on the Isle of Wight, this gorgeous little island off England's coast, where high society gathered every summer for regattas and parties. The kind of place where champagne flows freely and everyone's trying to see and be seen. Jenny was 20 years old, staying there with her mother and sisters, and if you'd seen her that day, you would have noticed her immediately. She was beautiful, strikingly so. Dark hair, grey eyes that one contemporary described as sparkling with the joy of living. But it wasn't just her looks. There was something about her presence, this confidence, this vibrancy that seemed distinctly, well, American. She laughed loudly. She spoke her mind. She rode horses fearlessly. She even had a small tattoo of a snake coiled around her left wrist, something almost scandalous for a woman of her time. Can you imagine showing up to a Victorian garden party with a visible tattoo? The British ladies must have clutched their pearls. Her father was Leonard Jerome, one of those classic American success stories. A financier, a speculator, a man who'd made and lost fortunes multiple times but always bounced back. They called him the King of Wall Street, at least during his winning streaks. The Jeromes had money, plenty of it, but they didn't have the kind of old money pedigree that mattered in New York society. So Mrs. Jerome, Jenny's mother, had done what ambitious mothers did. She'd taken her daughters to Europe, hoping to give them the polish and connections they couldn't get at home. At that sailing party, Jenny was introduced to a young man named Lord Randolph Churchill. He was the third son of the Duke of Marlborough, which meant he had the title, the connections, the bloodline, but not much money since everything would go to his older brother. Lord Randolph was smart, ambitious, already dabbling in politics, and the moment he saw Jenny, something happened. Now I want you to understand how unusual what happened next actually was. This wasn't the slow, proper courtship that British society expected. This wasn't months of chaperoned meetings and carefully orchestrated encounters. 3 days. They knew each other for 3 days before Lord Randolph proposed. 3 days. I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. Have you ever made a major life decision in 3 days? chosen where to live, what job to take, whether to move across the country. Now imagine choosing who to marry, knowing that decision is basically permanent in an era when divorce was nearly impossible. But Lord Randolph was smitten, completely, utterly smitten, and Jenny, she said yes. When news reached London, Lord Randolph's parents, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, were absolutely horrified. Their son wanted to marry an American A-girl they'd never met. From a family that made money through speculation and business, the Duchess reportedly said she'd rather he marry a housemaid. At least then they'd know what they were getting. The Duke and Duchess tried everything to stop the marriage. They argued, they pleaded, they insisted Lord Randolph wait, give it time, think it through. The engagement dragged on for months while both sets of parents negotiated like they were hammering out a peace treaty after a war, and then Leonard Drome put a number on the table, $250,000 as Jenny's dowry. In today's money, that's over $4 million. Suddenly the Churchills' objections got a lot quieter. Here's what I find fascinating about this moment. You can almost see both families doing the math in their heads. For the Dromes, they were buying their daughter a title, a connection to one of England's most prestigious families, proximity to actual royalty. For the Churchills, this was an infusion of desperately needed cash. The family was already feeling those financial pressures we talked about earlier. $4 million could solve a lot of problems. But here's the beautiful, complicated truth about Jenny and Randolph. Unlike many of the dollar princess marriages that would follow, theirs actually started with genuine attraction. That 3-day whirlwind was real passion, real chemistry, real feeling. They weren't being forced together by calculating parents, at least not at first. They chose each other. They married in April 1874 at the British Embassy in Paris. Jenny wore a dress she'd designed herself, and 7 months later, you can do the math there, she gave birth to a son. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Yes, that Winston Churchill, the Winston Churchill. The man who would lead Britain through World War II, deliver those stirring speeches about never surrendering, become arguably the most important British statesman of the 20th century. He was the son of the first dollar princess. But let's talk about what Jenny's life actually looked like, because it wasn't a fairy tale. Not exactly. For a while, things were genuinely good. Randolph's political career took off. He was brilliant, charismatic, a rising star in the Conservative Party. And Jenny was right there beside him, hosting gatherings, charming, influential people, using her American confidence and wit to open doors. She helped found the Primrose League, this political organization that actually let both men and women discuss politics, revolutionary for the time. She was smart, politically savvy, and people knew it. But here's where the story gets messy in ways the fairy tales never mention. Lord Randolph's career flamed out almost as quickly as it had risen. He made political miscalculations, burned bridges, alienated people who could have helped him. By his early 40s, his health was failing. Historians still debate exactly what was wrong with him, but he died in 1895 at just 45 years old, leaving Jenny a widow at 41, and Jenny's response. She didn't fade away into respectable widowhood like British society expected. Oh no. She launched a magazine, she wrote plays, she organised a hospital ship during the Boer War, literally chartered a ship, staffed it, and sent it to South Africa to care for wounded soldiers. The woman who'd started as just another rich American girl was becoming a force in her own right. But here's the part that really made society gossip: Jenny had affairs. Many affairs. Some historians suggest she had relationships with over 200 men. 200! Now, was that actually true, or was it Victorian-era slut-shaming? We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is that she definitely had a long affair with Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. The heir to the British throne was among Jenny's lovers, and everyone knew it, including his wife Queen Alexandra, who apparently didn't mind and actually enjoyed Jenny's company. Can you imagine the scandal? The American girl who'd married into the aristocracy was now sleeping with the man who would be king, and somehow, she pulled it off without being completely ostracized. That takes a special kind of charisma. Then in 1900, at age 46, Jenny married again. Her new husband was George Cornwallis West, who was, wait for it, just 16 days older than her son Winston. 16 days! She married a man who was essentially the same age as her firstborn child. The British press had a field day. Winston, to his credit, was reportedly very uncomfortable about the whole situation. That marriage lasted about 12 years before George left her for a famous actress. And did Jenny give up on love? Absolutely not. In 1918, at age 64, she married a third time to Montague Porch, who was 3 years younger than Winston, 3 years younger than her son. This woman did not care what anyone thought. Tragically, Jenny's life ended in a freak accident in 1921. She tripped and fell downstairs, broke her leg, and gangrene set in. They amputated the leg trying to save her, but she died a few weeks later at 67. Here's what Winston wrote about his mother's death, and I think it captures something essential about who she was. She was a great woman. The wind was in her veins. The wind was in her veins. Isn't that perfect? Because that's exactly what Jenny brought to Britain: wind energy. Movement change. She wasn't content to be a decorative duchess sitting quietly in drawing rooms. She wanted to live fully, love freely, make her mark on the world. And here's her legacy that matters most to our story. Jenny proved it could be done. She showed that an American girl could not only marry into British aristocracy, but could thrive. They could become influential, could make a real difference. Yes, her father's money had bought her entry, but what she did once she got through that door, that was all her. After Jenny, the floodgates opened. American mothers looked at her and thought, if the Durham girl can become Lady Randolph Churchill, if she can move in royal circles, if her son could potentially inherit a dukedom someday, why not my daughter? And British aristocrats, watching the Churchill family's financial situation stabilize, thanks to the American dowry, started thinking, well, if it worked for Randolph. The template was set. The path was proven. The first dollar princess had shown everyone how it was done. Now others would follow, some willingly, some reluctantly, some tragically, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own ways of navigating this strange bargain between old world titles and new world money. But the mechanics of how this actually worked, how these marriages were arranged, how families found each other across an ocean, how the negotiations happened, that's a story that deserves its own telling, because what developed was essentially a transatlantic marriage market, complete with catalogues, matchmakers, and price lists. It sounds almost unbelievable, but I promise you the reality was even stranger than you might imagine. So you want to know how this actually worked? How an American mother in New York connected her daughter with an earl in Yorkshire, how families negotiated these marriages across 3,000 miles of ocean. Well, buckle up, because what developed was essentially a marriage marketplace, so organized, so systematic, it would make modern dating apps look primitive. First, there was a publication, an actual quarterly magazine. Are you ready for this? It was titled Americans, a list of American ladies who have married foreigners of rank. Yes, that was a real thing that existed. This wasn't some gossip rag hidden under pillows. This was a respectable publication that families kept on their bookshelves like a catalogue. The 1890 edition listed every American woman who'd successfully married into European nobility, complete with details about their husbands, titles, estates, and this is the best part, their financial situations. But the really juicy section, the bachelor list, page after page of eligible European noblemen described with the kind of detail you'd use to sell a racehorse. Let me share some actual listings with you because they were absolutely wild. The Honourable Lionel Rothschild, 22 years old, heir to the Rothschild estates, an enthusiastic zoologist. Okay, that one sounds pretty good, right? Rich young likes animals. But then you get entries like this. The 12th Earl of Devon, 48 years old, owner of 53,000 acres heavily mortgaged, formerly a captain in the army and member of parliament, has sown wild oats extensively. They actually printed that. Imagine being that earl and reading about your wild oats in a magazine your potential future in-laws might be reading over breakfast. The 1890s version of a bad dating profile. Or how about Lord So-and-so, pleasant manners, some debt, small estate in Scotland. Translation charming, but broke and Scotland's cold. This wasn't romance. This was comparison shopping. American mothers would literally sit in their parlours with copies of titled Americans, going through the listings like they were browsing a Sears catalogue. This Viscount looks promising. Only 30 decent estate, not too many gambling debts. But having a catalogue was just the first step. To actually meet these men, you had to go to London for what they called the season. The London season ran from April through August, and it was essentially a 4-month marriage market disguised as a social calendar. There were balls, garden parties, concerts, theatre performances, races at Ascot Regattas at Henley. And everyone who was anyone in British high society would be there. For American families, preparing for a London season was like preparing for war. A very expensive, very fashionable war. It started in Paris. Before you even got to London, you stopped in Paris to build your wardrobe. And I'm not talking about picking up a few nice dresses. These mothers were spending what today would be $300,000 to $400,000 on clothes for a single season. $400,000 for one summer's worth of outfits. Why so much? Because you could not be seen in the same dress twice. Not at important events, anyway. The British aristocracy would notice. They would talk. And if you appeared to be economizing well, that rather defeated the purpose of demonstrating your wealth, didn't it? So you'd order dozens of gowns from the fashion houses in Paris. Day dresses, evening gowns, riding habits, walking suits, tea dresses, each one costing thousands. Each one meant to showcase not just your taste, but your family's seemingly bottomless bank account. Then you'd need jewelry. Ropes of pearls, diamond tiaras, emerald necklaces. Some families bought pieces from European royal collections. Catherine the Great's pearls, Empress Eugenie's diamonds. Nothing said, "We belong in your world," quite like wearing jewels that once adorned actual empresses. Now, once you arrived in London with your trunks full of Parisian couture, you needed a place to stay. Not just any hotel, you needed a proper address. Many families rented townhouses in Mayfair or Belgravia for the season. We're talking about thousands of pounds for just a few months' rent. But location mattered. The right address opened doors. And speaking of doors opening, here's where it gets really interesting. You needed to be presented at court. Being presented to the Queen was like getting a license to operate in British high society. Without it, you were nobody. With it, you could attend all the right balls, be invited to all the right houses, meet all the right people, including those eligible aristocrats. Now, technically, only married women with proper connections could present you at court. But here's the beautiful loophole that American families exploited. You could buy those connections. You could pay handsomely for a well-connected British woman to sponsor your presentation. It was done discreetly, of course. Money would change hands privately. But it happened all the time. The presentation itself was this elaborate ritual. You'd practice your curtsy for weeks. You had to wear specific clothing, a white dress, white gloves, ostrich feathers in your hair. You'd wait in long lines at Buckingham Palace, sweating in your corset, and then finally get your 30 seconds before the Queen, where you'd curtsy so low you practically kissed the floor and pray you didn't trip over your train. But once you'd done it, once you'd been presented, you were officially out in society. Game on. This is where the matchmakers came in. And the Queen of Matchmakers was an American woman who'd married well and knew exactly how the game worked. Minnie Stevens, who'd become Lady Paget. Lady Paget was brilliant. She'd crossed from America to Britain herself, understood both worlds, and she made it her business, quite literally her business, to introduce wealthy American girls to titled British men. She'd host parties, arrange accidental meetings, orchestrate seat assignments at dinners where the right people would end up next to each other. Was she paid for this? Officially, no. Unofficially. Let's just say that families who successfully married off their daughters, thanks to Lady Paget's introductions, tended to be very generous in their gratitude. Expensive gifts, donations to her favourite charities, that sort of thing. The whole season operated on this strange mix of rigid social rules and shameless networking. Every afternoon you'd make calls, visiting other families at their homes for exactly 15 minutes. Not 14, not 16. 15. You'd leave your calling card, make small talk, and try to gather intelligence who's looking to marry. What families are in financial trouble, which young lords are considered good prospects? The gossip network among these American mothers was incredibly efficient. They'd share information like stock tips. Stay away from the Duke of so-and-so, he drinks. The Earl of whatever just inherited death duties, he's desperate. Lord this and that is sweet on the Anderson girl, but his mother won't approve because of her grandfather's business in soap. Soap. Can you imagine? Sorry dear, you can't marry him because your grandfather manufactured soap. The snobbery was real, and then came the negotiations. Once a match seemed likely, once a young couple had been properly introduced and showed mutual interest, or at least mutual tolerance, the lawyers would step in. These dowry negotiations were handled exactly like corporate mergers. Both families would have solicitors who'd hammer out every detail in writing. How much cash would change hands? Would it be a lump sum or annual payments? What happened if the husband died? What happened if there were no children? What if there were only daughters who controlled the money, the husband or the wife? The typical arrangement looks something like this. The American family would provide a substantial dowry, anywhere from several $100,000 to several $1 million in today's money. This would usually be split into two parts: a lump sum paid immediately to settle debts, repair estates, pay death duties, and then an annual income for the couple's life. In exchange, the British family would provide a title, a position in society, and usually a legal agreement about where they'd live and how the wife would be treated. Some smart American lawyers even included clauses about infidelity or abuse ways for the woman to get some financial independence if the marriage went badly. It was all very unromantic, very calculated, very much like a business contract, because that's exactly what it was. But here's what fascinates me: despite all this calculation, despite treating marriages like real estate transactions, real feelings sometimes developed anyway. Some of these couples, thrown together by their families' financial needs and social ambitions, actually fell in love. Or at least they learned to care for each other, and some didn't. Some of these marriages were disasters from day one, loveless arrangements, where both parties felt trapped by duty and economics. And it's those stories, those heartbreaking stories of young women who went through this elaborate process, only to find themselves miserable in cold British mansions, that really reveal the human cost of this whole system. Which brings us back to Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose tears on her wedding morning we witnessed at the very beginning. Because Consuelo's story shows us what happened when this marriage market machinery ran at its most ruthless, when a mother's ambition and a duke's desperation combined to create what was essentially a perfect storm of misery. And understanding exactly how her particular nightmare unfolded will show us everything about what could go wrong when you treat your daughter like a commodity. There are moments in history where you wish you could reach through time and save someone. Consuelo Vanderbilt's story is one of those moments, and I need to tell it to you in full because understanding what happened to her, really understanding it, shows us the darkest side of this dollar princess phenomenon. Consuelo was born on March 2nd, 1877, into a level of wealth that's almost incomprehensible. Her grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built a railroad empire. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, continued expanding that fortune. By the time Consuelo was a teenager, her family was worth approximately $4 billion in today's money. $4 billion! She was quite literally one of the richest girls in America. And she was beautiful. Not just pretty, genuinely breathtakingly beautiful. Dark hair, delicate features, a tall, elegant figure. Artists begged to paint her. Photographers lined up to capture her image. She had everything you'd think would guarantee happiness. Except for one thing: her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, was, how do I put this gently? She was terrifying. Brilliant, ambitious, utterly ruthless, and completely convinced that she knew what was best for her daughter. And what Alva wanted, what she wanted more than anything, was for Consuelo to marry a duke. Not just any nobleman, a duke. The highest rank of aristocracy below royalty itself, because Alva had been rejected by New York society when she was younger, and she never forgot it, never forgave it. And she was determined that her daughter would achieve something no one could dismiss or diminish. Let me tell you about Consuelo's childhood, because it explains so much. Alva controlled every aspect of her daughter's life with an iron fist, and I mean that literally. She forced Consuelo to wear a steel rod down her spine, an actual metal contraption to improve her posture. For hours every day, this child had to sit and stand with a steel rod strapped to her back. If Consuelo disobeyed in any way, Alva would beat her with a riding crop. Not a gentle tap, real beatings, for minor infractions, for speaking out of turn, for showing any sign of independence. Consuelo later wrote in her memoir, and this breaks my heart: "I considered I had a right to choose my own husband. These words, the bravest I have ever uttered, brought down a frightful storm of protest." The bravest words she'd ever uttered were simply claiming the right to choose her own husband. Think about that. Think about living a life where saying I should get to pick who I marry required more courage than anything else you'd ever done. Now Consuelo did fall in love. Genuinely, deeply in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, and he was handsome, charming, kind, everything a young woman could want. He was American, from a good family, wealthy enough. And Consuelo adored him. They became secretly engaged. When Alva discovered this, she went to war. First she tried threats. She told Consuelo that if she married Rutherford, she'd have him killed. Actually killed. Whether Alva meant it or was bluffing, we'll never know. But Consuelo believed her mother was capable of it. When threats didn't work, Alva tried manipulation. She took to her bed, claiming that Consuelo's disobedience was literally killing her. She'd called Consuelo to her bedside, pale and weak, saying she was dying because of her daughter's selfishness. Imagine being 18 years old and being told your mother's imminent death is your fault. But Alva's real plan was already in motion. She'd been cultivating a relationship with Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Sonny, they called him not because he was cheerful, but because his secondary title was Earl of Sunderland, and Sonny was perfect for Alva's purposes. He was young, handsome enough, and most importantly, he was drowning in debt. Blenheim Palace. The Duke's ancestral home was falling apart. We talked about those 47 leaks in the roof earlier. That was his roof. The estate needed massive, expensive repairs. The agricultural depression had devastated the family's income. Sonny needed money desperately. So Alva invited him to Newport in the summer of 1895, and she basically orchestrated the whole thing like a military campaign. Dinners where Consuelo and Sonny were seated together, walks where they'd accidentally end up alone, constant pressure on both young people to see this as the perfect solution. For Sonny, it was simple math: marry Consuelo, get her enormous dowry, save Blenheim. For Consuelo, it was a nightmare. She didn't love him, she barely knew him, and she was still in love with Winthrop. But Alva was relentless. Day after day, she wore her daughter down. And finally, she did something that still shocks me, even knowing how this story ends. She locked Consuelo in her room. Not for an hour, not for a day. Consuelo was literally imprisoned in her own bedroom until she agreed to marry the Duke. A footman stood guard at her door. No one was allowed to see her, not her governess, not her friends, no one who might offer comfort or support. And Alva kept up the psychological warfare. She'd visit the room pale and trembling, telling Consuelo she was dying, that the stress was killing her, that if she died it would be Consuelo's fault. Can you imagine, locked in a room, your mother telling you you're murdering her by wanting to marry the man you love? Consuelo broke. Of course she broke. She was 18 years old, isolated, emotionally battered, and convinced her mother might actually die. She agreed to marry the Duke. Years later, during the annulment proceedings, Alva admitted it freely. She testified, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." Absolute power. Those were her exact words. The wedding was set for November 6th, 1895. And here's where we come back to that scene I painted for you at the very beginning: Consuelo in her room on the morning of her wedding, crying uncontrollably. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, she described that morning. "I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone. No one came near me. A footman had been posted at the door of my apartment, and not even my governess was admitted. Like an automaton, I donned the lovely lingerie with its real lace and the white silk stockings and shoes. I felt cold and numb. Like an automaton, a robot, not a bride." Outside St. Thomas Church in New York, the scene was chaos. 5,000 people, 5,000 had gathered trying to catch a glimpse of the wedding. It took hundreds of police officers to control the crowds. The newspapers called it the social event of the decade. Inside the church, Consuelo walked down the aisle in a dress that had cost tens of thousands of dollars. Her veil was so long it took 6 bridesmaids to carry it. The ceremony was magnificent, grand, the stuff of fairy tales. And Consuelo wept behind her veil the entire time. The newspapers reported it. Everyone could see she was crying, but people assumed they were tears of joy. They weren't. The dowry that had been negotiated was staggering even by dollar princess standards. William Vanderbilt provided $2.5 million in railroad stock, immediately about $42 million in today's money. Plus he committed to paying the couple an annual allowance of $100,000 for life, another $1.7 million per year today. When William died, there would be an additional $2.5 million transferred to trust. All told, we're talking about a settlement worth close to $100 million in modern money. The Duke of Marlborough had quite literally sold his title for one of the largest fortunes in history. And what did he do with it? He renovated Blenheim Palace extensively. The roof was repaired, the formal gardens were restored, he built a new library. Blenheim became magnificent again, one of the showplaces of England, all thanks to Vanderbilt money. But the marriage. The marriage was a disaster from the first day. On their honeymoon, on their actual honeymoon, Sonny told Consuelo something that she'd remember for the rest of her life. He said he'd only married her because he felt obligated to save Blenheim. That was it. Not because he cared for her, not even because he found her attractive, just duty and money. Can you imagine hearing that from your new husband? On your honeymoon, after being forced to give up the man you actually loved. When they arrived at Blenheim Palace, Consuelo's misery only deepened. The palace was massive cold and felt more like a museum than a home. She'd grown up in New York with central heating, hot running water, modern conveniences. Blenheim had none of that. She'd look out her window at a pond where a former butler had drowned himself, and she later wrote, "As one gloomy day succeeded another, I began to feel a deep sympathy for him." She was so depressed she sympathized with a man who'd killed himself. That's how bad it was. And Sonny. He was cold, critical, obsessed with protocol and tradition. He cared about appearances, about his position about Blenheim. He didn't particularly care about his wife. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, was even worse. She'd interrogate Consuelo constantly about whether she was pregnant yet. "Your first duty is to have a child, and it must be a son," she told Consuelo, because it would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke. Imagine that pressure. You're 19 years old, trapped in a loveless marriage in a foreign country, and your mother-in-law is constantly demanding you produce a male heir, while insulting your husband's cousin. Consuelo did have two sons, John in 1897 and Ivor in 1898. She famously coined the phrase, the heir and the spare, to describe them, and while she loved her children, they didn't make her marriage happier. She and Sonny lived increasingly separate lives. They'd have dinner together. She dreaded those dinners, wrote about how oppressive they were, but otherwise barely spoke. He had his interests, his mistresses. She had loneliness mostly. But here's where Consuelo's story takes an interesting turn. About 4 years into the marriage, she managed to reconnect with Winthrop Rutherford. She spent 2 weeks with him in Paris, and while we don't know exactly what happened, historians strongly suspect they had an affair. Her younger son Ivor looked nothing like Sonny, but had a striking resemblance to Rutherford. Make of that what you will. Whether or not Ivor was Rutherford's biological son, that reconnection gave Consuelo something precious, hope. Hope that she wasn't entirely trapped. Hope that she could reclaim some piece of her own life. By 1906, she and Sonny officially separated. They lived apart for 15 years before finally divorcing in 1921. And then in 1926 they had their marriage annulled by the Catholic Church. Sonny wanted to convert to Catholicism, which didn't recognize divorce. The annulment was supported by testimony from Alva herself, now older, and perhaps somewhat repentant, who admitted in court that she had forced her daughter into marriage. But here's the beautiful part, the part that makes this story bearable. Consuelo found happiness eventually. In 1921, right after her divorce, she married Jacques Balsan, a French pilot, a pioneer of aviation, a man she actually loved. They lived together in a beautiful chateau near Fontainebleau. Winston Churchill and his wife were frequent visitors. Even Alva, in her old age, bought a neighbouring chateau to be near her daughter. The two women who'd been through such terrible conflict eventually reconciled and actually became close in their final years. Consuelo lived until 1964, 87 years old. Long enough to see the entire world change, long enough to write her memoir and tell her story in her own words, long enough to find genuine love and peace. But the question that haunts me, that should haunt all of us, was it worth it? Was the title, the palace, the position in society worth those decades of misery, worth giving up the man she loved, worth being locked in a room and psychologically tortured into submission? I think we know the answer, and I think Consuelo knew it too. Which is why her story stands as the most famous, most tragic example of what could go wrong when families treated their daughters as commodities to be traded for social advancement. But Consuelo wasn't alone in her suffering, and not every dollar princess story ended with eventual happiness like hers did. There were others whose experiences were different, some better, some worse, and understanding what daily life was actually like for these American women in British aristocratic households will help us see the full picture of this extraordinary phenomenon. What happens when you take a girl who's grown up with electric lights, central heating and hot running water and drop her into a medieval castle in the English countryside? The answer is culture shock so severe it could break your spirit. Let me take you inside what daily life was actually like for these American brides. Because the reality was so different from what they'd imagined that many of them spent their first months in England crying themselves to sleep every night. First, the physical shock. These girls had grown up in modern American mansions, places like the Vanderbilt's Marble House in Newport or the Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue. These homes had the latest technology electric lighting, hot water heaters, proper bathrooms, radiators pumping heat through every room. Some even had early air conditioning systems. They were comfortable, warm, dry. Now imagine arriving at your new husband's ancestral estate in England. It's October. The rain is constant, that famous British drizzle that seeps into your bones. You walk into this massive stone structure that's been standing for 300, 400, maybe 500 years, and you realise with growing horror that it's essentially still functioning like it did in 1650. Taking a bath wasn't a matter of turning on a tap. Oh no. A housemaid, sometimes multiple housemaids, would have to carry jugs of hot water up from the kitchen in the basement. Up multiple flights of stairs. 5 trips, 6 trips, however many it took to fill a hip bath. By the time you got in half, the water would be lukewarm at best. One American duchess wrote home to her mother, "I have never been so cold in my entire life. I wear 3 layers of undergarments, 2 petticoats, and I still shiver through dinner." The British seem not to notice. I think they must have ice water in their veins instead of blood. There's actually something darkly funny about that, isn't there? These girls had married into what they thought was luxury dukes, castles, nobility, only to discover that the lifestyle was less comfortable than what they'd left behind in supposedly vulgar America. The bedrooms were the worst. Massive rooms with soaring ceilings and stone walls that radiated cold. You'd have a fireplace, but it would heat maybe a 6-foot radius around it. The rest of the rooms stayed freezing. Girls would pile blankets on their beds, sometimes 6 or 7 heavy blankets, and still wake up able to see their breath in the air. May Golay, who married the Duke of Roxburgh, wrote that she'd wake up in the morning to find frost, actual frost, on the inside of her bedroom windows. Inside, in her bedroom, in a palace. And the dampness. England's climate is wet, and these old stone buildings never fully dried out. Your clothes felt damp. Your sheets felt damp. Everything smelled faintly of mildew. American girls from dry California or sunny Newport would develop persistent coughs, catch cold after cold. Some developed serious respiratory problems that plagued them for life. But the physical discomfort was only part of the shock. The social rules were even more jarring. In America, especially if you were wealthy, you had a certain amount of freedom. You could speak your mind at dinner parties. You could laugh loudly. You could express enthusiasm or excitement without being considered vulgar. American society valued confidence energy that can do spirit. Not in aristocratic England, not even close. British high society operated on a complex unwritten code of behaviour that took years to master. And if you got it wrong, people would notice, they'd talk, and you'd be marked as an outsider forever. For example, visiting cards. In America, you might casually drop by a friend's house. In England, there was an entire ritual around calling cards. You had to know when to leave 1 card versus 2 cards versus 3. You had to know which corner to turn down to indicate different messages. If you were married, you left your husband's card plus 2 of your own, but only if it was a formal call. For an informal call, different rules applied, and heaven help you if you got it wrong. One American bride accidentally left the wrong number of cards at a duchess's home. That duchess didn't speak to her for 2 years. 2 years. Over visiting cards. The dinner rituals were equally complex. You couldn't just sit where you wanted. Seating was arranged by rank. The highest-ranking woman would go into dinner on the arm of the highest-ranking man, then the second highest, and so on down the ladder. As a new duchess or countess, you had to know exactly where you ranked compared to everyone else. And if you made a mistake, if you sat in the wrong place or went through a door ahead of someone who outranked you, the whole room would notice. Table manners were different too. Americans ate with their forks in their left hands and knives in their right, then switched. The British kept their forks in their left hands the entire meal. Seems minor, right? But British aristocrats would literally watch how you held your silverware to determine if you were properly brought up. The conversation rules were even stranger. You were expected to be witty, but not too witty. Charming, but not too familiar. You could discuss art, music, literature, perhaps politics in very general terms. But you absolutely could not discuss money, even though everyone knew that's why you were there. You couldn't talk about business or commerce. Your father's railroad empire or steel mills were vulgar topics. And you had to pretend that marrying for money was somehow less important than marrying for love, even when everyone knew better. Many American girls found this exhausting. They were used to being themselves saying what they thought. Now they had to constantly monitor every word, every gesture, every expression. And the British made sure they knew they were outsiders. The snobbery was real and it was relentless. "She's very charming for an American," was a common backhanded compliment. The emphasis on "for an American" told you everything. No matter how beautiful you were, how educated, how refined, you'd always have that qualifier attached to you. Titled, "British women would sometimes refuse to acknowledge American duchesses socially. They'd cut them at parties, literally turn their backs when introduced." The message was clear: you bought your way in, but you'll never truly belong. One American countess wrote in her diary, "They take our money readily enough, but they never let us forget that we're not really one of them. I'm a walking bank account in their eyes, nothing more." The loneliness was crushing. These girls were typically 18, 19, 20 years old. They'd been plucked from their families, their friends, everything familiar, and dropped into a foreign country where they were simultaneously resented and needed. Letters home became lifelines. They'd write to their mothers, their sisters, their friends back in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, pouring out their homesickness. "I miss American sunshine," one girl wrote. "I miss American voices. I miss the way Americans laugh without apologizing for it." The weather didn't help. British winters are dark grey, endlessly drizzly. The sun might not properly come out for weeks. For girls used to crisp, bright American winters or mild California weather, the gloom was oppressive. Seasonal depression was common, though they didn't have a name for it then. They just knew they felt sad all the time and couldn't explain why. Food was another adjustment. British aristocratic cuisine in the 1890s was, well, let's just say it wasn't exciting. Lots of boiled vegetables, overcooked meat, heavy bland puddings. The British seemed to view food as fuel rather than pleasure. American girls raised on their family's French chefs and continental cuisine found British food nearly inedible. "I dream of a proper American steak," one duchess wrote, "or even a decent salad. The British boil lettuce, I'm not joking. They actually boil lettuce and serve it as a side dish. I nearly wept." Have you ever felt truly homesick? Not just missing home, but that physical ache in your chest, that feeling that you're in the wrong place and might never feel right again. Now imagine feeling that way, while everyone around you insists you should be grateful for your position. But here's what's interesting. Not all American brides experienced it the same way. Some struggled terribly. Some, like Consuelo, were genuinely miserable for years, but others adapted, thrived even. The difference often came down to their husbands. If your husband was kind, if he made an effort to help you adjust, if he defended you against British snobbery, life could be manageable, even happy. Nancy Langhorne, who married Waldorf Astor and later became the first woman to sit in British Parliament, was one of the success stories. Waldorf adored her. He supported her independence, her American directness, her political ambitions. Together they became a genuine power couple. Macaulay, despite the frozen windows, apparently had a decent marriage to the Duke of Roxburgh. He was kind to her, and she found purpose in managing his estates and doing charitable work. Mary Leiter, who married George Curzon and became Viceroy of India, had what seemed to be a genuinely affectionate relationship. She wrote that while she missed America, she found her life in India fascinating and felt like she was doing important diplomatic work. So what made the difference? What separated the women who found happiness from those who spent decades being miserable? Partly it was luck of the draw in husbands, but partly it was something else, something in the women themselves. The ones who succeeded found ways to use their American qualities as strengths rather than handicaps. They took that American confidence and turned it into leadership. They took that American informality and made British society a little less stuffy. They took that American practicality and actually improved how estates were managed. They refused to just be decorative duchesses sitting quietly in drawing rooms. They became activists, philanthropists, political figures, social reformers. They took the position they'd been sold into and made it mean something. But even for the ones who succeeded, there was always that underlying tension. They were changing British society, yes. But was British society changing them? Were they losing themselves in the process of trying to fit in? And at what cost did this acceptance come? These questions become even more complex when we look at the flip side of this story, the men. Because while we've been focused on the brides and their experiences, we haven't really examined what it was like to be one of these British aristocrats who essentially sold their names for cash. What was going through their minds? How did they justify it to themselves? And how did they treat these women who'd been purchased for them like prizes at auction? The answers might surprise you because the men in these marriages were often just as trapped by circumstances as the women were, just in different ways. We've spent so much time with the brides understanding their pain, their struggles, their courage. But every transaction has two parties, and I think it's time we talked about the men, these British aristocrats who stood at altars and promised to love women they barely knew women they'd essentially been paid to marry. Were they all villains, cold-hearted fortune hunters who saw American girls as walking bank accounts, or were some of them victims too trapped by duty and desperation? The truth, as always, is more complicated than we'd like it to be. Let's start with understanding the pressure these men were under, because it was immense. Imagine you're the eldest son of a duke. From the moment you're born, your entire life path is predetermined. You will inherit your father's title. You will inherit the estate, thousands of acres, a massive house that's been in your family for centuries, tenant farmers who depend on you for their livelihoods, servants whose families have worked for your family for generations. You don't get to choose this. You don't get to say, actually, I'd rather be a doctor, or I think I'd prefer to live in London and paint. Your duty is clear: preserve the family legacy, keep the estate intact, pass it on to your son. That's your job. That's your entire reason for existing according to the world you were born into. Now add the agricultural crisis we talked about earlier. The income that supported all of this, the estate, the house, the lifestyle, is evaporating. Wheat prices have collapsed. Tenant farmers can't pay rent. The roof is literally leaking. You need, let's say, £50,000 immediately just to prevent the East Wing from collapsing entirely. Another £100,000 to pay off death duties from your father's passing. And there's no money. None. Your mother is frantic. Your aunts are writing letters. Your family's solicitor is giving you grim updates about mounting debts. Every day you're reminded if you don't do something, the estate will be broken up and sold. Centuries of family history gone. Farmers evicted, servants dismissed, all because you failed in your duty. And then someone mentions that there are wealthy American girls whose fathers would pay handsomely for a title. What do? Do you sacrifice your family's heritage on the altar of romantic ideals? Or do you make the practical choice, the dutiful choice, and marry for money? Some men genuinely agonized over this decision. Victor Cavendish, who married Evelyn Fitzmaurice, wrote to a friend, "I feel like I'm prostituting myself, but what choice do I have? The alternative is watching everything my family built for 400 years crumble into ruin." That word, prostituting. He felt like he was selling himself, and in a way he was. But here's where I lose sympathy for some of these men, how they treated their wives afterward. Take Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough Sonny. We've talked about what he did to Consuelo, but let's look at it from his perspective for a moment, not to excuse him, but to understand him. Sonny was 23 when he inherited the dukedom. His father had died, leaving him with Blenheim Palace and catastrophic debts. Sonny had been in love with someone else, another woman, an English woman he'd wanted to marry. But she didn't have money and Blenheim needed money desperately. So Sonny broke off his relationship and went to America to find an heiress. It was business, pure business. He met Consuelo, saw that she was beautiful, and came with an enormous fortune and made the arrangement. Did he feel guilty? Maybe. Did he wish things were different? Probably. But from his perspective, he was doing his duty. He was saving Blenheim. That was what mattered. The problem, and this is where any sympathy I have for him evaporates, is how he treated Consuelo once they were married. That comment on their honeymoon telling her he'd only married her to save Blenheim. That was cruel. Unnecessarily cruel. Even if it was true, you don't say that to someone. And his coldness throughout their marriage, his constant criticism, his affairs, the way he made her feel unwanted and unvalued, none of that was necessary. You can marry for practical reasons and still treat your spouse with basic human kindness. Sonny chose not to. After his divorce from Consuelo, Sonny married again to Gladys Deacon, an American woman he'd been in love with for years. So he did finally get to marry for love. You know how that ended, even worse than his first marriage. Gladys had injected paraffin wax into her face to maintain her looks, and it destroyed her appearance. Sonny became disgusted by her. They lived separately in different parts of Blenheim, and finally he cut off the electricity to her section of the house to force her to leave. What I'm saying is, Sonny was capable of cruelty regardless of whether he married for love or money. The problem wasn't the transactional marriage, the problem was Sonny. But not all these men were like him. Some genuinely tried to make their marriages work. George Curzon, who married Mary Leiter, seems to have actually loved his American wife. Mary brought a substantial dowry. Her father was a Chicago millionaire, but George and Mary developed real affection for each other. When he was appointed Viceroy of India in 1899, Mary threw herself into the role, becoming a skilled diplomat and hostess. George relied on her judgment and valued her partnership. When Mary died young at just 36, George was genuinely devastated. He wrote that she had been the most devoted and perfect of wives. That wasn't just public posturing. His private letters show real grief. So it was possible. Transactional marriages could become real partnerships, even love matches. Waldorf Astor, who married Nancy Langhorne, is another example. Waldorf was wealthy himself. The Astors were one of the richest families in both Britain and America. He didn't need Nancy's money, but she was American divorced and considered somewhat scandalous. He married her anyway because he genuinely cared for her, and their marriage was by all accounts happy. Waldorf supported Nancy's political ambitions when that was still radical. When she became the first woman to sit in Parliament, he was proud of her. They worked as a team, but these were the exceptions. For every George Curzon or Waldorf Astor, there were several men who approached these marriages with either cold indifference or active resentment. Some resented their American wives for being necessary. Does that make sense? They needed the money desperately, but they hated needing it, and they took that resentment out on their wives. "You're here because we need your money, and I despise you for it." That was the unspoken message. The 8th Duke of Manchester, who married Consuelo Isnaga, was a notorious philanderer. He spent his wife's money on his mistresses, on gambling, on maintaining a lifestyle in London, while leaving Consuelo isolated in the country. He made no secret of his affairs. He humiliated her publicly. When people criticised him, his attitude was essentially, "She bought a title. She got what she paid for. I don't owe her anything else." Can you imagine living with someone who thought that way about you? And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Many of these men had been raised to believe that women existed primarily to provide heirs and manage households. They weren't supposed to be intellectual equals or companions, certainly not partners. When their American wives started expressing opinions about politics or wanting to be involved in estate management, or heaven forbid having their own interests and ambitions, many British husbands were genuinely shocked and offended. "My wife wants to redecorate the drawing room" might sound trivial, but to these men it represented American wives trying to change British tradition. "My wife has opinions about how the estate should be run" was seen as overstepping. These men wanted their wives to be grateful, decorative, and silent. The American women raised in a culture that at least somewhat valued female education and independence weren't wired to be decorative and silent. Conflict was inevitable. There's also this: many of these British aristocrats were deeply insecure. Their entire identity was tied up in their titles and their family heritage. They didn't have professions or accomplishments of their own. They were their names and their bloodlines, period. And here came these American women whose fathers had actually built something: railroads, businesses, industries. Men who'd started with nothing and created empires through intelligence and work. The British aristocrats who'd inherited everything and built nothing sometimes felt inferior by comparison, and they handled that insecurity by asserting dominance over their wives in the only way they could: through coldness, through control, through reminding their wives that in Britain titles trumped accomplishments. It's almost sad in a way. These men had been told their whole lives they were special, superior part of an elite that was ordained by birth to rule. And then reality crashed in, they were broke, their way of life was dying, and they needed money from American tradesmen's daughters to survive. That's a hard pill to swallow for an ego raised on aristocratic superiority. But again, and I can't stress this enough, none of this excuses cruelty. You can be insecure and still be kind. You can be desperate and still be decent. You can marry for practical reasons and still treat your spouse with respect. Some men managed it. They recognized their wives as human beings in impossible situations and tried to make the best of things. They became partners, friends, sometimes even lovers. Others chose bitterness and resentment. They took their anger about their circumstances out on women who had even less choice in the matter than they did. Because let's be honest, most of these men could have refused to marry Americans. Yes, their estates might have suffered. Yes, their families would have been disappointed, but they had options. Get a job, sell some land, downsize their lifestyles. Their wives often didn't have those options. Many, like Consuelo, were literally forced into these marriages. So while I can understand the pressure these men faced, While I can even sympathise with their impossible situations, I can't excuse how many of them chose to respond to that pressure by making their wives miserable. What strikes me most looking at these marriages is the waste of it all. Here you have young men and young women, many of them intelligent, capable, interesting people, and they're trapped in loveless arrangements that make them both unhappy, all because of economic forces beyond their control and social systems that valued bloodlines over individual happiness. And the question that keeps nagging at me, did anyone actually win in this arrangement? The estates were saved, yes. The titles continued. The American families got their social acceptance. But at what human cost? How many decades of unhappiness? How many lives spent performing roles rather than living authentically? The thing is, some of these marriages did eventually evolve into something better. Time children shared experiences, sometimes they created bonds that transcended the original transaction. And then there were the marriages that stayed cold until death finally released both parties from their vows. But there was another side to this story that we haven't fully explored yet, one that shows these American women at their absolute best. Because while many struggled with homesickness and difficult husbands, some of them decided to use their positions to actually change things. They became political activists, social reformers, philanthropists who left legacies far beyond just saving some aristocrat's estate. And those stories of women who refuse to be just decorative duchesses, those are the ones that truly inspire. Here's the part of the story that gives me hope. Because yes, many of these women suffered. Yes, they were trapped in difficult circumstances. But some of them remarkable, fierce, determined women decided that if they were going to be stuck in these gilded cages, they were damn well going to shake the bars until something changed. They didn't just become decorative duchesses. They became revolutionaries in silk gowns and tiaras. Let's talk about Nancy Langhorne Astor. Because Nancy's story is proof that sometimes the most unlikely people end up making history. Nancy was born in Virginia in 1879, daughter of a railroad businessman who had lost everything in the Civil War and slowly rebuilt his fortune. She was beautiful, witty, sharp-tongued, and married young to a man who turned out to be an alcoholic. She divorced him, scandalous for the time, and moved to England for a fresh start. In 1906, she met Waldorf Astor at a house party. Now the Astors were complicated, technically American by origin, but they'd been in Britain long enough to be considered British aristocracy. Waldorf was wealthy, titled, and unlike many British men, he actually appreciated Nancy's American directness and intelligence. They married in 1906 and Nancy threw herself into British life, but not the passive decorative version. Oh no. Nancy had opinions and she wasn't afraid to share them. She became obsessed with social reform, child welfare, housing conditions for the poor, alcohol abuse. These weren't fashionable causes for aristocratic ladies to champion. You were supposed to do polite charity work, maybe organise a bazaar, donate to a hospital. Nancy wanted to actually change laws. In 1919, Waldorf inherited his father's title and had to leave the House of Commons. Peers couldn't serve there. His Plymouth constituency needed a new representative, and Nancy decided to run for his seat. Let me be clear about how radical this was. Women had only gotten the right to vote the previous year, 1918. The idea of a woman actually serving in Parliament. It was considered absurd by most people, unnatural, against God's design. One male politician said that having women in Parliament would be like putting lipstick on a bulldog. Nancy ran anyway, and she won. On December 1st, 1919, Nancy Astor became the first woman to actually take a seat in the British House of Commons. There had technically been one woman elected before her, Constance Markievicz, in 1918, but she was Irish and refused to take her seat as a political protest. Nancy was the first to actually serve. Picture this scene. Nancy walks into the House of Commons for the first time as a member. The chamber is full of men, hundreds of men in dark suits, many of whom had voted against women's suffrage, many of whom thought she had no business being there. She's wearing a simple black suit. She's nervous. Years later, she admitted she was terrified, but she walks in with her head high, takes her seat and gets to work. The male MPs didn't make it easy. Some refused to speak to her, others made crude jokes. Winston Churchill, yes. Jenny Durham's son initially opposed women in Parliament and wasn't particularly welcoming to Nancy. But Nancy was tough. She'd survived an abusive first marriage divorce-related scandal and years of American immigrant snobbery. A bunch of stuffy British politicians weren't going to intimidate her. She fought for children's rights. She pushed for laws protecting young people from alcohol. She advocated for better housing for the poor. She championed women's education. And she did it all with a sharp wit that made her both admired and feared. When male MPs would try to dismiss her opinions because she was a woman, she'd fire back. One man told her, "You're only here because you're a woman." She replied, "And you're only not here because you're not a man enough to have been elected by one." Nancy served in Parliament for 25 years. 25 years of pushing, fighting, advocating, refusing to be silenced. She paved the way for every woman who came after her. And here's what I love about this: Nancy was a dollar princess. Her American background, her family's money. That's what gave her the confidence and resources to do what British women of her class wouldn't dare. American women were raised to believe they could do things, could speak up, could make a difference. Nancy brought that attitude to British politics and changed it forever. But Nancy wasn't alone in using her position for social good. These American women spread across Britain in their various estates started a quiet revolution. Consuelo Vanderbilt, despite her unhappy marriage, became a passionate advocate for women's suffrage. She worked with organisations fighting for women's right to vote. She gave speeches, wrote articles, donated money. When British suffragists were being arrested and force-fed in prison, Consuelo used her position as a duchess to speak out against it. Think about the courage that took. Her husband didn't approve. British society thought women's suffrage was dangerous and unseemly, but Consuelo had been forced into marriage against her will. She understood what it meant to have no power over your own life. And she was determined that other women would have more choices than she'd had. She also did extensive charity work. During World War I, she helped run hospitals. She organised relief efforts. She visited wounded soldiers and raised funds for veterans. The girl who'd wept on her wedding day became a woman who found meaning through service. After her divorce and remarriage to Jacques Balsan, she continued her activism. She lived until 1964, long enough to see women voting women in Parliament, women with legal rights she couldn't have imagined in 1895. And she'd been part of making that happen. Then there's Jenny Churchill, who we talked about earlier, but we didn't fully explore her work during the Second Boer War. In 1899, when Britain went to war in South Africa, Jenny did something extraordinary. She chartered an entire hospital ship, the SS Maine. Not just paid for it. Chartered it, staffed it, equipped it, and sailed with it to South Africa. She was 45 years old, sailing into a war zone to personally oversee medical care for wounded soldiers. How many aristocratic ladies would do that? Most would maybe organise a fundraising ball in London and call it patriotism. Jenny went to the actual war. The Maine treated thousands of wounded soldiers. It saved countless lives. And Jenny was there working alongside nurses and doctors, seeing the horrific injuries, the suffering, and refusing to look away. She also founded and edited a literary magazine, the Anglo-Saxon Review. It only lasted a few years because it was too expensive to sustain, but for a while Jenny ran a serious intellectual publication. She wrote plays. She advocated for better treatment of soldiers and veterans. She was politically active until her death in 1921. What these women understood, what they figured out, was that being a duchess or a countess gave them a platform. They could use that platform to do nothing, to simply exist as decorative figures. Or they could use it to actually help people. Many chose to help. They renovated estates, yes, but they also improved conditions for the tenant farmers and workers on those estates. They built schools. They funded hospitals. They created employment programs. American efficiency and practicality met British tradition, and sometimes the result was genuine progress. Helena Zimmerman, who married the Duke of Manchester, worked extensively on education reform. She believed that poor children deserved the same quality of education as wealthy ones, a radical idea at the time. She funded schools, trained teachers, and pushed for curriculum improvements. Vivian Gould, who married Lord Deases, became known for her work with disabled veterans after World War I. She helped create rehabilitation programs and employment opportunities for men who'd been permanently injured in the war. These weren't just token charity efforts. These women were using their wealth, their positions, their American can-do attitude to create real lasting change. And they faced criticism for it. British aristocrats thought they were being too involved, too hands-on, too American about everything. A proper duchess doesn't get her hands dirty with actual work, they'd say. You're supposed to be above such things. But these American women had been raised differently. They'd seen their fathers build businesses, create jobs, actually do things. The idea of just existing ornamentally felt wrong to them. If they had resources and power, they wanted to use them for something meaningful. There's something beautifully ironic about this, isn't there? These women had been bought, let's not sugarcoat it. They'd been purchased by British aristocrats who needed their money. The transaction was supposed to benefit the British families. The women were supposed to be grateful for their titles and quietly fade into the background. Instead, they used those titles as weapons for social change. They took the platform they'd been sold into and used it to advocate for people who had no platform at all. They turned being bought into being empowered. Not all of them, of course. Some remained bitter about their circumstances. Some never found purpose beyond their unhappiness. Some were too beaten down by cold husbands and colder castles to fight for anything. But enough of them became change makers that their collective impact on British society was profound. They modernised estates. They challenged social norms. They advocated for women's rights, children's welfare worker protections, educational access. They brought American ideals about democracy and opportunity into the heart of British aristocracy. And perhaps most importantly, they raised children, sons and daughters who grew up with American mothers who told them that titles were nice, but accomplishments mattered more. That being born to privilege meant you had a responsibility to help others, that women were just as capable as men. Winston Churchill, raised by Jenny, absorbed his mother's fierce independence and political savvy. Consuelo's sons grew up watching their mother survive and eventually escape an unhappy marriage, then find genuine love and purpose. These lessons shaped the next generation. The dollar princesses were supposed to be a footnote wealthy American girls who bought their way into British society and then disappeared into the background. Instead, many of them became the authors of their own stories. They refused to be just commodities. They insisted on being human beings who mattered. But for all their achievements, for all the ways some of these women transcended their circumstances, we still have to reckon with the fundamental truth of what this phenomenon represented. These were marriages built on transactions. Love was optional, choice was rare, and when love and choice are removed from something as intimate as marriage, when people are treated as means to financial or social ends, the psychological damage can be devastating. And that damage didn't just affect the couples themselves, it rippled outward to their children, their households, their communities. The question we need to ask is, what did all this cost? Not in dollars or pounds, but in human happiness, in wasted potential, in lives spent performing roles instead of living authentically. Love, when it's absent from a marriage, doesn't just leave a void. It creates a pressure that has to escape somewhere. And in the world of dollar princesses and their aristocratic husbands, that pressure found release in affairs, scandals and relationships that shocked even jaded British high society. We need to talk about the messiness, the affairs, the betrayals, the desperate attempts to find something real in marriages built on everything but love. Because this is where the human cost of these transactional marriages becomes most visible and most painful. Let's start with a man we've mentioned briefly, the 8th Duke of Manchester, who married Consuelo Isnega in 1876. And when I say his behaviour was appalling, I mean it was legendary for being appalling, even in an era when aristocratic philandering was more or less expected. Consuelo Isnaga, not to be confused with Consuelo Vanderbilt, was actually the inspiration for Edith Wharton's novel The Buccaneers. She was Cuban-American, beautiful, vivacious, and her family had serious money. The Duke needed that money. The arrangement was made. From the beginning, the Duke made no secret of his infidelity. He kept multiple mistresses. He'd spend Consuelo's dowry money on these other women jewellery apartments trips. He'd take his mistresses to social events where his wife would be present. The humiliation was intentional and public. Consuelo's response, she created her own social circle. She became a celebrated hostess known for her wit and charm. She befriended the Prince of Wales and became part of his inner circle, which meant she had more social power than her own husband in many ways. It was her quiet revenge. I might be stuck with you, but I don't need you. The Duke gambled away fortunes, ran up debts, and when Consuelo's money ran out, he started selling family heirlooms. He was by all accounts a disaster of a human being. And yet they stayed married for decades because divorce was still scandalous and complicated. Their children grew up in this atmosphere of mutual contempt masked by social niceties. Can you imagine what that does to a child, watching your father humiliate your mother publicly, while your mother maintains perfect composure in public and weeps in private? But affairs weren't just the domain of the husbands. The wives had them too. And given how many of these marriages were loveless, can you really blame them? We touched on Jenny Churchill's numerous relationships, but let's talk about the reality of what that meant. Victorian and Edwardian British society had this strange double standard. Married aristocrats having affairs was sort of expected. As long as you were discreet, as long as you maintained appearances, as long as you'd already produced an heir, affairs were tacitly accepted. The rule was simple: be unfaithful if you must, but never be obvious about it. Never cause a scandal that forces society to acknowledge what everyone already knows. Jenny navigated this brilliantly. Her affairs were with powerful, influential men, the Prince of Wales, various politicians and aristocrats. She was discreet enough to maintain her reputation, while indiscreet enough that everyone knew. It was a delicate balance, and she walked it perfectly. But not every woman had Jenny's social skill or powerful connections. Some who had affairs found themselves ostracized, gossiped about, socially destroyed. The double standard was brutal. A man could have as many mistresses as he wanted as long as he was discreet and suffer no real consequences. A woman who had even one affair, if it became public knowledge, could lose everything: her reputation, her social standing, even access to her own children. Lady Colin Campbell, born Gertrude Blood, she married Lord Colin Campbell, became embroiled in one of the most scandalous divorce cases of the Victorian era. Both spouses accused each other of adultery. The trial became a sensation. The newspapers printed every salacious detail. And when it was over, even though the divorce wasn't granted, both their reputations were destroyed. Gertrude spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild her reputation. She became a writer and journalist, actually quite successfully. But she was never fully accepted in high society again. One publicised affair, whether it happened or not, and she was marked forever. This brings us to one of the strangest, saddest stories in the whole Dollar Princess saga, the second marriage of the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Sonny Consuelo Vanderbilt's ex-husband. Remember, Sonny and Consuelo divorced in 1921 and had their marriage annulled in 1926. And Sonny immediately married the woman he'd apparently been in love with for years, Gladys Deacon. Gladys was an American, incredibly beautiful, and known as one of the great intellects of her generation. Marcel Proust called her the most magnificent woman he'd ever met. She spoke multiple languages, discussed philosophy and art with genuine knowledge, and had been part of the most sophisticated circles in Paris. Sonny had been obsessed with her for decades. While he was still married to Consuelo, he'd commissioned a sculpture of Gladys's eyes and had them installed at Blenheim. Yes, really. He was so in love with another woman that he put a sculpture of her eyes in his family palace while his wife still lived there. So when he finally got to marry Gladys, you'd think he'd be happy, right? This was his great love. The woman he'd pined for. The marriage was a catastrophe from the start. Here's what happened. Gladys, obsessed with maintaining her beauty, had started injecting paraffin wax into her face as a primitive form of cosmetic enhancement. This was before modern cosmetic surgery, before anyone understood what would happen. The wax migrated, hardened, and slowly destroyed her face. Her features became distorted, swollen. And Sonny, who'd loved her partly for her beauty, became repulsed by her. He couldn't bear to look at her. Think about that. This woman had waited decades for him. She'd finally gotten him, and now her appearance was deteriorating through no fault of her own. She'd been trying to stay beautiful for him, and he rejected her because of it. They began living in separate parts of Blenheim Palace. Sonny would spend months in London. Gladys would wander the empty palace with her pack of dogs she collected, stray dogs, dozens of them, perhaps because they were the only creatures who didn't judge her appearance. The final cruelty, Sonny cut off the electricity to her section of the palace. Literally. He shut off her power to force her to leave. She lived in darkness in rooms that had once been her dream, surrounded by dogs abandoned by the man who'd claimed to love her. She eventually had a breakdown and was institutionalized for 2 years. After that, she lived in poverty in a small apartment, forgotten by the society that had once celebrated her beauty and intelligence. Sonny died in 1934, converting to Catholicism at the end, perhaps seeking forgiveness. Gladys lived until 1977, 96 years old. The last 40 years of her life lived in obscurity and poverty, haunted by what she'd lost. If that story doesn't haunt you, I don't know what will, because it shows how shallow these marriages could be. Sonny claimed to love Gladys for decades, but when her appearance changed, that love evaporated. It had never been about who she was as a person. It had been about what she looked like, what she represented. Now you might be wondering, did any of these marriages end well? Were there any divorces that led to genuine happiness? Yes, some. Consuelo Vanderbilt, as we discussed, found happiness with Jacques Balsan after her divorce. They had nearly 30 years together, living between France and America, surrounded by friends and family. She finally got the loving partnership she'd been denied in her youth. But divorce was still difficult even when both parties wanted it. British divorce law in the late Victorian and Edwardian period was designed to keep marriages intact at all costs. You couldn't divorce just because you were unhappy or incompatible. You needed grounds: adultery, cruelty, desertion. And even when you had grounds, the process was expensive, public, and humiliating. Everything would be aired in court and reported in newspapers. Every affair, every argument, every private moment would become public entertainment. Many couples preferred to simply live separately rather than go through a formal divorce. They'd maintain the appearance of marriage while living completely separate lives. The husband would stay in London, the wife at the country estate, or vice versa. They'd see each other only when absolutely necessary for social occasions. This arrangement protected their reputations but trapped them in a kind of limbo. Not truly married, but not free to move on either. The psychological toll of these situations was enormous. Depression was common among these dollar princesses, though it wasn't called that. They'd talk about melancholia or nervous exhaustion. But what they were describing sounds a lot like clinical depression. Persistent sadness, loss of interest in activities, feelings of hopelessness, isolation. Some turned to alcohol, some to laudanum, or opium-based medication that was legal and commonly prescribed for women's problems. Addiction was easy and common, though rarely discussed openly. And the children suffered in ways that are heartbreaking to contemplate. Growing up in a household where your parents barely spoke to each other, where affection was performed for outsiders but absent in private, where everyone was acting a role. What does that do to your understanding of love, of marriage, of relationships? Many children of these dollar princess marriages grew up and made similar mistakes. They married for duty or money or social pressure, perpetuating the cycle. Some rebelled, spectacularly scandalizing society with unconventional relationships. Some became cynical about love entirely. Winston Churchill, whose parents' marriage was passionate but troubled, was deeply scarred by watching his father's decline and his mother's affairs. He wrote about it obliquely in his memoirs, the pain still evident decades later. Consuelo's sons had to watch their mother suffer in silence for years before she could escape. They knew the marriage was unhappy. They knew their father was cold to their mother. What lessons about manhood, about how to treat women, did they absorb from watching their father? There's something profoundly sad about the waste of it all. These were people, often intelligent, interesting, capable people, trapped in situations that made them miserable. And because they were wealthy, entitled, society assumed they had no right to complain. You live in a palace, people would say. You have everything. But you can be miserable in a palace just as easily as in a cottage. Sometimes more easily because the cage is more beautiful. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone thought you should be happy but you weren't? Where your actual feelings didn't match what people expected you to feel? That disconnect, that inability to acknowledge your own unhappiness because it seems ungrateful or incomprehensible to others. It's isolating in a way that's hard to explain. That's what many of these women lived with daily, surrounded by luxury and beauty, isolated in their unhappiness, unable to speak it aloud. But this story does have an ending. Not always a happy one, but an ending nonetheless. Because nothing lasts forever, not even systems built on centuries of tradition. The world that made dollar princess marriages possible was about to change dramatically. And when it did, when World War I shattered old certainties and new social movements gained momentum, the whole phenomenon would finally begin to unravel. Everything changed on a summer day in 1914. Not just for the dollar princesses, not just for the British aristocracy, but for the entire world. And when it was over, when the guns finally fell silent 4 years later, the world that had made these transatlantic marriages necessary and possible was gone forever. World War I didn't just kill millions of soldiers, it killed an entire way of life. Let me take you to Britain in 1914, just before the war. The dollar princess phenomenon is still going strong. American heiresses are still crossing the Atlantic, still marrying into titles, still saving estates. The system is working exactly as designed. Then Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo, and within weeks Europe is at war. At first everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. Home before the leaves fall, they said. Young British aristocrats enlisted enthusiastically, seeing it as an adventure, a chance to prove their worth in battle like their ancestors had. These were men raised on stories of military glory, men who'd been told their whole lives that their bloodlines made them natural leaders. They went to war in their hundreds, dukes' sons, earls' heirs, viscounts and barons. The cream of British aristocracy marched off to the trenches of France and Belgium, and they died. In staggering numbers, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Passchendaele, Verdun. These weren't the glorious cavalry charges their grandfathers had known. This was industrial warfare, machine guns, artillery, poison gas trenches that became mass graves. Noble blood offered no protection against a German bullet or a lungful of chlorine gas. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, Britain had lost almost 1 million men, and a disproportionate number of them were from the aristocracy. Entire family lines ended in the mud of Flanders. Estates that had passed from father to son for centuries suddenly had no heirs. The casualties were devastating. Estimates suggest that 1 in 5 peers or heirs to peerages were killed. 1 in 5. Can you imagine that 20% of the aristocracy's next generation simply gone? And those who came back, many came back damaged. Shell shock we called it then. PTSD we call it now. Men who'd been psychologically shattered by what they'd witnessed. Others came back physically maimed, missing limbs, blind, disfigured. The war destroyed more than bodies. It destroyed certainty. The British aristocracy had always believed in their inherent superiority, their natural right to rule. But in the trenches, a duke's son died just as easily as a factory worker. Bloodlines meant nothing to artillery shells. Meanwhile, back on the home front, women had taken over men's jobs. They'd worked in factories, driven ambulances, served as nurses, managed farms and estates. They'd proven they could do everything men could do. The old arguments about women being too delicate, too irrational, too weak to vote or work or participate in public life, the war had shattered those arguments completely. In 1918, British women over 30 got the right to vote. In 1928, it was extended to all women over 21. The world was changing. And then there were the economic consequences. The war had been ruinously expensive. The British government had borrowed heavily raised taxes dramatically, and when it was over, the bills came due. Death duties inheritance taxes, which had been introduced in 1894, were increased significantly after the war. Before the war, the top rate was 8%. By 1919, it was up to 40%. 40% of an estate's value had to be paid in cash when someone died. Remember what we talked about earlier. These estates were land-rich but cash-poor. Inheriting a title after World War I often meant inheriting a financial catastrophe. You'd get a crumbling mansion, depleted farmland, and a tax bill you couldn't possibly pay. The only option for many families was to sell the art, sell the furniture, sell the land itself. Between 1918 and 1921, over a quarter of England changed hands. A quarter. Estates that had been held by the same families for 500 years were broken up and sold. It was the greatest transfer of land ownership in Britain since the Norman Conquest. The agricultural depression that had started in the 1870s never really ended. If anything, it got worse after the war. Mechanization was making large estates less profitable. Global trade meant British farmers couldn't compete with cheap imports from America, Australia, Argentina. Being a duke or earl used to mean something economically. Now it just meant you owned a very expensive building you couldn't afford to maintain. But here's the really interesting shift American society was changing too. Remember Mrs. Astor and her ballroom that could only hold 400 people? Remember how new money families were excluded from high society? Well, by the 1920s, that system was crumbling. Why? Because there were too many rich people to ignore. The Industrial Revolution had created wealth on a scale never seen before. You couldn't maintain an exclusive social club when half of New York's wealthiest citizens were excluded from it. The old guard had to adapt or become irrelevant. More importantly, American values were shifting. The Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties. This was an era that celebrated entrepreneurship, innovation, success through merit rather than birth. Making your own fortune was becoming more admirable than inheriting one. American heiresses no longer needed European titles to be accepted in New York society. They could be accepted for who they were, for their family's accomplishments, for their own merits. The cachet of being a duchess wasn't worth what it used to be. And there was another factor, the flapper generation. Young American women in the 1920s were different from their mothers and grandmothers. They cut their hair short, wore dresses above the knee, smoked cigarettes, drank cocktails, drove cars, had careers. They'd seen their mothers fight for suffrage and win. They expected independence, autonomy, choice. The idea of being shipped off to marry some British aristocrat they'd never met, that sounded less like a prize and more like a prison sentence to these modern young women. Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, had enough money to marry any title she wanted. Instead, she married for love 7 times, actually, to increasingly disastrous effect, but that's another story. The point is she had choices. Her generation had choices. The last major dollar princess marriages happened in the early 1920s. By the 1930s, the phenomenon was essentially over. There are statistics that tell this story. In the peak, years 1895 to 1905, there were dozens of these marriages every season. By the 1920s, maybe a handful per year. By the 1930s, almost none. The market had collapsed. British titles just weren't worth what they used to be. Partly because the British aristocracy had less actual power, the House of Lords had lost most of its political authority in 1911. Partly because maintaining estates had become economically insane. And partly because American society no longer cared. A few British aristocrats still tried the old strategy, but it was different now. They weren't looking for massive dowries to save estates, they were looking for wealthy women who might be willing to help maintain a lifestyle. The desperation was less acute, the transactions were smaller scale, and the women who did marry British aristocrats in the 1930s and beyond did so primarily for love or genuine shared interests, not because their mothers locked them in rooms until they agreed. The children of the dollar princess marriages, what happened to them? Many became thoroughly British, absorbed into aristocratic society. Consuelo Vanderbilt's sons, for instance, became the 10th and Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill. They were educated at Eton, and Oxford served in World War II, lived their lives as British aristocrats. If you met them, you wouldn't necessarily know their grandmother was American. But the American heritage was there in the bloodlines, and it kept appearing. Here's something most people don't know. Princess Diana had American ancestry. Her great-great-grandfather was James Work, an American businessman from Ohio. His daughter Frances Work married the future Baron Fermoy in 1880. Frances was a dollar princess, though a minor one compared to the Vanderbilts and Astors. That American blood passed down through the generations, Frances, to Maurice Roche, to Ruth Roche, to Frances Shand Kidd, to Diana Spencer, which means Prince William and Prince Harry, future kings of England, have American ancestry from the dollar princess era. There's something beautifully ironic about that. The British aristocracy looks down on American new money families. They took their cash reluctantly, viewed the dollar princesses as necessary evils, and now, generations later, American blood runs in the veins of the British royal family itself. The phenomenon left other legacies too. The idea that you could marry across class lines for financial benefit became more socially acceptable. The strict rules about marrying within your class loosened. The dollar princesses had proven that outsiders could enter the aristocracy and not only survive, but sometimes thrive. They'd also proven that women could be forces for change, that American directness and practicality could improve British institutions. That tradition wasn't sacred, it could be questioned, challenged, changed. Looking back now, we can see the dollar princess era as a transitional moment. It was the last gasp of the old aristocratic world trying to sustain itself by importing money from the new capitalist world. It couldn't last because the world was changing too fast. The internet would have made it impossible anyway. Can you imagine doing this in the age of social media? Duke seeks heiress must have $50 million discretion required. The public scrutiny, the mockery, the criticism, it would be unbearable. But in a way, similar patterns continue. Wealthy people still marry across international lines for status, for citizenship, for business connections. Russian oligarchs' daughters marry into European aristocracy. Chinese heiresses marry into old money American families. The specifics change, but the fundamental exchange money for prestige cash for cachet that hasn't entirely disappeared. What has changed is women's choices. Modern women aren't locked in rooms until they agree to marry. They're not sold into marriages they don't want. Legal protections exist. Divorce is accessible. Women have their own money, their own careers, their own power. The dollar princesses help them make that possible. By surviving impossible situations, by eventually finding their voices, by fighting for women's suffrage and social reform, they helped create a world where their daughters and granddaughters would have choices they never had. But to truly understand their legacy, to see what they gave us beyond just historical fascination, we need to step back and look at the whole phenomenon with clear eyes. What does it teach us about money and love, about choice and duty, about the price we pay when we treat people as commodities, and how do we honour these women's stories while learning from the mistakes that made their suffering possible? So here we are at the end of this long, complicated, heartbreaking and occasionally triumphant story. And I want to take these final minutes to sit with you and really think about what it all means. Because the story of the dollar princesses isn't just history. It's not just something that happened to wealthy women over a century ago. It's a story about the eternal tension between love and duty, between personal happiness and family obligation, between what we want for ourselves and what others want from us. Let me ask you something. If you could go back in time and speak to 18-year-old Consuelo Vanderbilt on the morning of her wedding, locked in that room crying into her hands, what would you say to her? Would you tell her to run, to escape consequences, be damned? Would you tell her that no title, no estate, no amount of family pressure is worth decades of misery? Or would you tell her what actually happened, that she'd survive it, that she'd eventually find her voice and her freedom, that she'd go on to do meaningful work and eventually find real love, that her suffering wouldn't be for nothing because it would help pave the way for other women to have more choices? I think about this a lot. Because the easy answer is to say she should have run. But we're looking at it from the outside with the benefit of hindsight and modern values. For her in that moment, with her mother dying or claiming to be dying, with her entire family's expectations weighing on her, with no real support system and nowhere to run to, running wasn't a simple choice. And that's what makes these stories so profound. These weren't weak women, they were trapped women. There's a difference. Consuelo survived 25 years of an unhappy marriage and came out the other side still capable of love, still fighting for causes she believed in still herself. That takes extraordinary strength. Nancy Astor took the position society gave her, Lady Astor, a title she got through marriage, and used it to become the first woman to actually serve in Parliament. She took a gilded cage and turned it into a platform. Jenny Churchill, who'd been bought for her father's money, raised a son who would save Britain in its darkest hour. Winston Churchill's confidence, his eloquence, his refusal to give up, where do you think he learned those traits? From his American mother, who never let British snobbery break her spirit. These women were told they were commodities, walking bank accounts meant to save failing estates. Some of them believed it, but others refused to accept that definition. They insisted on being more than their dowries, more than their titles, more than what their marriages had reduced them to. And here's what I find most inspiring: they didn't all succeed. Some remained miserable, some never found happiness or purpose, some were genuinely broken by their experiences. This isn't a tidy story where everyone who works hard gets a happy ending. But enough of them found ways to matter, ways to use their positions for good, ways to change the system from inside ways to ensure that their daughters and granddaughters wouldn't face the same impossible choices that their collective impact transformed society. Think about what they accomplished. They helped normalize the idea that women could marry across class and national boundaries, and not just survive, but thrive. They proved that women could be political forces, social reformers, activists who made real change happen. They brought American values about merit work and accomplishment into a British aristocracy that had been stagnating in centuries of tradition. They raised children who were exposed to both American independence and British tradition, creating a generation that could bridge worlds. And perhaps most importantly, many of them became advocates for women's rights precisely because they'd experienced firsthand what it meant to have no rights, no choices, no power over their own lives. When Nancy Astor fought for children's welfare laws, she was fighting for children to have better lives than the one she'd had married off young to an alcoholic. When Consuelo Vanderbilt advocated for women's suffrage, she was fighting for women to have the political power she'd been denied in her personal life. These weren't abstract causes for them. They were deeply personal. But let's talk about the uncomfortable truths too, because I don't want to romanticize this story. The dollar princess phenomenon was built on inequality, on a system where wealth could buy almost anything, including human beings. These women may have been rich, but they were still treated as property. Their experiences, while unique in many ways, reflect a broader truth about how women throughout history have been traded, sold, married off against their will. Poor women face similar situations without the cushion of wealth. They were married off for economic security, for family alliances, for survival. They just didn't get to live in palaces while they suffered. And we need to acknowledge that these American families, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Jeromes, many of them built their fortunes on the backs of workers who were exploited, on business practices that were ruthless, on systems that created massive inequality. The very money that funded these transatlantic marriages came from somewhere. It came from railroads built by underpaid, overworked labourers, from factories where children worked 14-hour days, from business practices that crushed competition and manipulated markets. So when we think about the dollar princesses, we need to hold multiple truths at once. These women suffered in ways that were real and painful. They also had privileges that most people could never imagine. Their stories matter, and their stories are part of a larger system of inequality that harmed far more people than it helped. Does that make their suffering less valid? No. Does it mean we shouldn't learn from their experiences? Absolutely not. But it does mean we need to see their stories in context. What then are the lessons for us, for people living in 2025 in a world that seems completely different from the Gilded Age? First love matters. It sounds simple, even trite, but it's true. Relationships built purely on practical considerations, on money, on status, on what your family wants. Those relationships struggle. Some survive, many don't. The human need for emotional connection, for genuine affection, for being seen and valued as a person, that need doesn't go away just because the practical considerations are met. Second choice matters. Having agency over your own life, the ability to make your own decisions even when they're difficult, that's fundamental to human dignity. When that's taken away, when you're forced into situations against your will, the psychological damage can last a lifetime. Third context matters. It's easy to judge historical figures from our modern perspective. Why didn't she just leave? Why didn't he treat her better? But people are products of their time. Understanding the pressures they faced, the options they had, or didn't have the values they were raised with, that doesn't excuse bad behaviour, but it helps us understand it. Fourth change is possible. The world that made dollar princess marriages necessary lasted for about 40 years, and then collapsed. Systems that seem eternal, that seem unchangeable, can actually transform remarkably quickly when circumstances shift. The social rules that govern those marriages, the idea that women couldn't vote, couldn't work, couldn't choose their own husbands, those seemed immutable. They weren't. And finally, individual choices matter even within unjust systems. Consuelo could have let her circumstances destroy her. Instead, she became an advocate for change. Nancy Astor could have been content with her title. Instead, she fought to give other women political power. Jenny Churchill could have quietly faded into respectable widowhood. Instead, she kept living fully loving, freely refusing to be diminished. They couldn't change the systems they were born into, but they changed how they move through those systems. And collectively, they changed the system itself. Is there a modern equivalent to dollar princesses, sort of? International marriages where wealth or citizenship or business connections are major factors, those still happen. But the power dynamics are different now. Women have more legal protections, more economic independence, more ability to walk away from bad situations. That's progress. Real progress. And it happened partly because women like the dollar princesses survived their ordeals and then fought to make sure other women wouldn't have to endure the same. But we still see echoes of these patterns. People still marry for practical reasons, for immigration status, for financial security, for business alliances. And as long as economic inequality exists, as long as some people have vastly more resources than others, there will be relationships where money creates imbalanced power dynamics. The question isn't whether these dynamics exist, they do. The question is, how do we navigate them? How do we ensure that people entering relationships for whatever reasons maintain their dignity, their agency, their humanity? I don't have perfect answers. I don't think anyone does. But I think the stories of the dollar princesses offer us guidance. Choose compassion when you can. Maintain your sense of self even in difficult circumstances. Use whatever power you have to help others. Fight for systemic changes that give people more choices. Don't let anyone reduce you to a commodity. And maybe most importantly, your circumstances don't define you. Your choices within those circumstances do. Consuelo Vanderbilt was sold into marriage. That's a fact. But she's not remembered primarily as a victim. She's remembered as a woman who survived, who found her strength, who made her life mean something despite its painful beginning. That's her legacy. That's what she chose. As I come to the end of this story, I find myself thinking about all the women whose names we don't know. The dollar princesses who weren't famous enough to be written about, whose stories weren't dramatic enough for memoirs, who lived and suffered, and occasionally triumphed in quiet ways that history didn't record. They were there too. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, each with her own story of hope, disappointment, adaptation, survival. And I think about the servants in those great houses, the maids who carried hot water up the stairs, the housekeepers who listened to these women cry, the governesses who watched the children absorb their parents' unhappiness. They saw it all. Their perspectives are largely lost to history. I think about the men who weren't dukes or earls, but who loved these American girls and lost them to more titled suitors. Winthrop Rutherford, who loved Consuelo and watched her marry someone else who carried that loss for decades. History tends to focus on the dramatic stories, the famous names, the extremes, but this phenomenon touched thousands of lives in ways both large and small, and each of those lives mattered. So what do we take from all of this? What's the point of spending these hours together diving deep into the lives of women who lived and died generations ago? I think it's this: human experiences across time have common threads. The desire to be loved for yourself, not your money or your usefulness. The struggle between duty and desire. The courage it takes to survive impossible situations. The ways people find meaning even in suffering. These aren't Victorian problems or Gilded Age problems. These are human problems. And the solutions these women found or failed to find can guide us still. Their resilience inspires us. Their failures warn us. Their victories show us what's possible. When I started researching the Dollar Princesses years ago, I expected to find a straightforward story of wealthy women complaining about their gilded cages. What I found instead was infinitely more complex women who were simultaneously privileged and powerless, who had everything and nothing, who were trapped in systems they didn't create but had to navigate anyway. I found women who were products of their time and also rebels against it, who accepted their circumstances and also fought to change them, who made peace with their lives and also never stopped wanting something different. In other words, I found human beings in all their complicated, contradictory glory. And that's the story I've tried to tell you tonight. Not a simple tale of victims and villains, not a romance or a tragedy, but something messier and more real, the story of people trying to make decent lives within systems that weren't designed for their happiness. Some succeeded, some didn't. All of them tried. And that trying, that refusal to give up, that insistence on finding meaning and purpose, even in gilded cages, that's what makes their stories worth telling. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, I hope you'll carry these stories with you. I hope you'll remember Consuelo's tears and her eventual triumph, Nancy's courage, Jenny's fierce independence, Gladys's tragedy, all of them in their different ways showing us what it means to be human in difficult circumstances. And perhaps you'll think about your own life, your own choices, your own gilded cages, whatever form they take. Because we all have them, don't we? Circumstances that constrain us, expectations that weigh on us, situations that feel impossible. The Dollar Princesses can't tell us how to escape our cages, but they can show us how to survive them with dignity, how to find purpose within them, and sometimes how to eventually break free. That's their gift to us. That's their legacy. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to these long ago stories, for caring about women whose struggles and triumphs happened in a world very different from ours, but whose humanity echoes across the years. I hope these stories have moved you, challenged you, maybe even changed how you think about marriage, money, choice, and the complicated ways they intertwine. Sleep well wherever you are. Dream of grand ballrooms and transatlantic journeys of courage found in desperate situations of women who refused to be only what others wanted them to be. And when you wake, I hope you'll carry with you the lesson these Dollar Princesses taught us, that we are more than our circumstances, more than what others try to make us, more than the roles we're assigned. We are always ourselves, and that self is worth fighting for. Until next time, when we'll explore another fascinating corner of history together, take care of yourselves. Remember that your story matters, your choices matter, and your refusal to be diminished matters. Good night and sweet dreams.